Well, hello and welcome back to episode 6 of our 10 video series on early Genesis. In our last video, we are in the midst of looking at group 2 in terms of our agenda for this video series, and we looked at setting and characters in the last video, and this time we're going to be beginning to look at the plot. Well, we'll look at the entire plot and we'll begin to analyze it, but there's too much we won't be able to finish, and so it'll be the video after this in which we finish group 2. We've spent a long time here, but it actually sets the groundwork for looking at the next group, which is all about the flood story. So, we move to the plot. Now, before we begin, we have to acknowledge, or at least I'm going to proclaim unto thee, that we have a preconception problem. We think we know what this chapter of Genesis is, and it is, in our minds, the fall. And our Bibles don't help with this, what I'm calling a problem, a preconception problem, because for example, here's a picture out of the NIV. Just as we move into chapter 3, the publishers of the NIV have helpfully put in this heading, and usually these headings are helpful in our Bibles. They break up the space, makes it easier to look at the page, and they also allow us to quickly skim through, for example, and if we know approximately where the parable of the prodigal son is, just to name one, we can find it using these headings. But by putting the fall in here, it really colors how we read the plot in a very negative way. If we're going to think exegetically, though, there are some interesting facts about the so-called fall. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe that we are sinful and that we are fallen creatures and that we are broken and that we need healing and we need to be made whole. I'm not denying that at all. But when I say we have to be careful exegetically speaking, I mean if we're approaching the text and asking what did it mean then and there are some interesting facts that will make us hesitant to label this chapter the fall. For example, Genesis never blames the man and the woman in this story for the sinfulness of any other person on earth. But the doctrine of the fall, especially as it was formulated by Augustine, so the Augustinian understanding of the fall is there were two human beings at some point in history, and when they ate the wrong fruit from the wrong tree in the garden, then at that moment all humanity throughout time and space became tainted and irreparably damaged and have nothing but sinful tendencies. And Genesis just doesn't do that. Genesis never blames the man and the woman for the sinfulness of any other person on earth. And that's ever. Genesis just never, ever does that. In fact, neither does the rest of the entire Old Testament. There is not one time, and you could expect it in something like a psalm, where the psalmists are very raw and honest with God about how they're feeling, and not once is there an expression of frustration, only if only they had not eaten that fruit. It just doesn't happen. In fact, after Genesis 5, Eve disappears from the Old Testament entirely. Adam shows up only a handful of times in the rest of the Old Testament, but some of those times, our translations say Adam with a capital A, but add a footnote, this could also be translated mankind. Other times, the word Adam with a capital A refers to a place name. And it's only a couple of times that it might be Adam as in the character of this story, but never as the source of our sin. It just doesn't happen. Despite all this, we think we know what's coming in the story because we've been led by these headings, the fall, to think and to look for these things. And this is what we see. We see restriction, don't eat that fruit. Temptation, disobedience, prosecution, punishment, expulsion, sent out of the garden, and then ultimately death. That's what we see in the story. We've been led by things like that heading, the fall, to see these things in the story. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, and I'll try to make my point later, but I'll just give you a teaser now. I'm going to suggest to you that this is precisely how the serpent would like us to think of this story. This is precisely what the serpent wants us to see, because this is all the serpent is equipped to see. I'll come back to that idea later. Let's go to the text. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to paraphrase it, and then we'll start to analyze. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" The man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this," and then the consequence is in poetic form, "cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." To the woman he said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." To the man he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." The man named his wife Eve, because she would become the mother of all the living. The Lord God made garments of skin for the man and his wife, and clothed them. And the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove them out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. That is the text. Now, a paraphrase. I will highlight portions of the text and just kind of give my own take, just to give us, again, a sense of how the plot flows, and then we'll move into some analysis. So the serpent sidles up to the woman and says, look at all these beautiful trees. It's too bad you can't eat any of it. Which is, of course, an exaggeration. And she counters that with another exaggeration. Oh, no, we can't. We just can't eat from the tree in the middle, and we can't even touch it. Or she takes the exaggeration the other direction. Or we'll die. No, you won't die. And then the serpent says to the woman something that logically doesn't make much sense, but emotionally really packs a punch. You are being treated unfairly. God is withholding something from you. God is afraid of the power that you could gain. It's not fair. And then says, you can be unfair too. You could be like God and have that kind of power to be unfair. The woman is then interested, and the tree's good and beautiful, and she wants the wisdom because knowledge will bring power. So she eats it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. I wonder if you noticed when I read this is the first we hear that he's been there. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her. There was one scholarly book I read on early Genesis where, in a footnote, the author said, the woman talks and reasons and debates and thinks and decides and acts. The man, he just eats. And you really get that sense that there's this mouth-breathing, almost drooling oaf of a male just standing there, and she says, here, eat this. And he says, oh, okay. And it really, I believe, is intended to be a bit of a poke at the hierarchy in the ancient Near East, and sadly, not only in the ancient Near East, where men consider themselves superior to women. This story really undermines that hierarchy, as we'll see. The man does not show well in this story. Then they realize that knowledge they sought didn't bring them power. It brought them shame. And they do something that's really, really foolish. It's basically this. Hey, here comes the creator and sustainer of the entire universe. Let's hide behind this tree. That will fool him. I mean, really, it's just the silliest thing. But God calls out a question, where are you? And the man, like every 3-year-old with whom you have played hide and seek, calls out basically from behind the curtain, I'm hiding right here. I'm behind the curtain. You can't find me. I'm hiding. And God asks patient questions and then listens as everybody blames everybody else. And then God says to the serpent, the consequence of all of this is that you will struggle with humanity. And to the woman, you will struggle in childbirth and struggle with your husband. And to the man, you will struggle with the ground and then eventually return to it. The man named his wife Eve, which most scholars believe is an ancient Hebrew word for living, or a Hebrew word that sounds like living, because she had this amazing life-giving power. So essentially, he names her life giver. And then God does for the man and the woman what they cannot do for themselves, and that is provides them with decent clothes. Those fig leaves have just not been up to the task. And then they are sent east of the Garden of Eden. They have lost something beautiful. Okay, let's begin our analysis. We will begin the analysis in this video and finish it in the next one. We have been asking all sorts of what I would call exegesis questions. These are questions that get us back into the mindset of the people who first told these stories and the people who first heard them. Questions like, who wrote this? When? To whom was this written? And why? Where was this written? How was it intended to be understood? What was the assumed culture of the time? And was that anything like our culture? What kind of literature is this? And is it anything like the kinds of literature that we write? What other unspoken assumptions or information did the original author and readers share with each other, but not with us? And we ask these questions, of course, to recreate as best we can the cloud, the original cloud of shared assumptions, so that we can actually climb inside these stories and hear them from the inside and hear what they were meant to proclaim. Now, most of these questions we've either talked about directly or indirectly, but there's one we haven't talked about much, and that is, what kind of literature is this? And is it anything like the kinds of literature that we write? And when we think about the Eden story, and when we approach it from our column over here, with our normal scientific way of doing things, if we were left to our own devices, here's what we would see. And we do see. We see two people with names. We see eventually that those names are connected to genealogies, which eventually get to Abraham, and then there are other genealogies that eventually get from Abraham to David and beyond, to Jesus, etc. And it starts to get into eras that we can historically verify with other ancient sources. And so we see history. We see an historical account of something that happened to these two people. And so we read it as we would read history. That is to say, literally. We read the story as if it were a literally as if we were reading any other kind of modern historical document. And that reminds me of a conversation I had with an internationally respected Old Testament scholar. And I haven't asked him for permission to pass along this conversation, so I'm leaving him unnamed. And we were sitting in his office discussing the Eden story and some of the challenges people have when reading it and understanding it. And he said something interesting. He's a gentle, kind man, but he said something interesting. He said, it's impossible to read the Eden story in a strictly literal way. Nobody does it. People think they do, and then he added, and they don't like it when I point out otherwise. People think they do, but even those who claim to read the Eden story strictly literally don't. They just don't. It's impossible, he says. And some of the reasons why it's impossible to read the Eden story in a strictly literal way are, if this was a work of modern history, we would say there are inconsistencies. I'm putting them in quotation marks there because it's not a work of modern history. But there are inconsistencies between the first creation story and the second creation story. Here's a quick chart that shows some of those differences. If we read the first creation story, the man and the woman were created at the same time. But in the second one, they're created separately, quite a bit separately. All the animals are created in between and named. In the first one, vegetation shows up before the man. In the second one, it's after the man. In the first one, animals before the man. In the second story, animals appear after the man. In the first story, the heavens and the earth are created in 6 days, but in the second story, the heavens and the earth are created in 1 day. That's hard to see in English translation, but in Hebrew it says, here's what happened when the Lord, on the day that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. And it's the same Hebrew word as the 6 used in the 6 days. The English translations usually change that to just when the Lord created the heavens and the earth. But anyway, if you're reading strictly literally, there are things that cannot be reconciled between the first and the second creation stories. Also, let's think about the serpent. If we're going to read this strictly literally, do we have here a snake that talks? Do we have here a snake that is standing on legs because the punishment eventually is crawling? The serpent is going to eat dust all the days of its life. Is that what happens? Do snakes eat dust all the days of their lives? God talks about the enmity between your offspring to the serpent and her offspring. Are we talking about little human babies and little snake babies that are fighting each other? Again, people don't think that way because they're not reading it strictly literally. They hear the sound of God as he's walking in the garden. Is God then a physical being who makes sounds while walking? And again, people don't think that, but if you're reading strictly literally, you might have to. Also, the fall, as we've already discussed, it's not there. So if you understand chapter 3 as the fall, you're not reading strictly literally. You're actually reading in a very powerful symbolic way. But it's not there in Genesis 2 and 3. That's the Eden story, and it's not in Genesis anywhere, as we've discussed. Okay, So, no, they're in the Old Testament. Sorry, keeps growing. And we've already seen the impossibility of reading strictly literally in the chapter before the Eden story, when we saw this worldview, this cosmology, described quite clearly in Genesis chapter 1. Now, it doesn't matter how strictly literally a person reads the Eden story, they probably don't think that there's an entire ocean up above a vault that's up in the sky. And they probably don't think that if they got in an airplane and flew, they might hit the stars or the sun or the moon. Or if they managed to dodge all those things, that they would just run right into that vault that's holding up the ocean. People don't think that, which means they're not reading strictly literally. And we will also see in the chapter that follows the Eden story, we will also see that it's impossible to keep reading in a strictly literal way, because Cain is going to say, my punishment's more than I can bear, blah, blah, blah. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Well, who is Cain afraid of? If we're reading strictly literally, there's Adam, Eve, and Cain. That's it. And then this will happen. Cain made love to his wife. Well, who's that? And then Cain is building a city. Well, for whom? And so, as I say, nobody reads strictly literally. At some point, everybody steps off that train. And so the question becomes, what do we do then? What do we do about that? For some people, that can feel really uncomfortable, that we just can't read these first chapters of Genesis in a strictly literal way, because then it feels like it's a bit of a free-for-all and everyone can just kind of sort of make up their own reality, and that doesn't seem right either. There's this saying in biblical studies that when the going gets tough, and that's the way it feels at this moment for some people, when the going gets tough, the tough get exegetical. And that's what we're going to do. The answer to, well, then what, is exegesis. We're going to stop worrying about just how scientifically we can read these chapters, and we're going to start to just let the original context and let the original culture lead the way. What did it mean then and there is a very healing way of dealing with the anxiety of, how literally shall I read this? Let's just let the original context and culture lead the way. That brings us to someone I'd like to introduce you to, John Walton. There he is, nice young man, and he is a professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, which is about an hour west of Chicago if the traffic is good, which it never is. And he has written all sorts of books. I think his most important book is this one, Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. And I like the subtitle, Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible. It is this book which has shaped the way this video series is going. Having read this book, it really shaped the way I approach early Genesis. This book was successful enough that it is now in a second edition, but he's been busy writing other books as well, many of them having to do with the old Genesis particularly, and how it relates to the ancient Near East, and then how we should think of it today. Well, in a video interview, John Walton was asked about the Eden story and how to think about the man and the woman, and his response, and I'm picking John Walton not just because of that book, which has been really influential for me, but also just to show you that this is a really conservative scholar at a conservative institution in the States. And so he is not someone who has an agenda to, quote unquote, undermine the Bible and turn it into a kind of spiritual coloring book where we can all create our own comfortable images. No, this is someone who takes the Bible very seriously and takes biblical study very seriously. And here's what he says about reading the Eden story. Is the text trying to tell me something that is uniquely true of the individual Adam? Something that just applies to that one person back then? Or is the text trying to tell me something that's true of all of us? And John Walton says that when he looks at the text on its own terms and takes it seriously and looks for the clues and follows where the text leads, when he reads the text carefully and thinks about it in terms of the ancient Near East and what else he knows, because he knows a lot about ancient Near Eastern culture, it's very clear to him that the text is trying to tell us something that's true of all humanity, not just of that man and that woman back then. So according to John Walton, the Eden story is much more than a story about two people long ago. And there are clues in the text. What might they be? Things like this. The names of the man and the woman. That name means mankind. And Eve, as I've said, means life giver, which is maybe just another way of saying womankind. So we have two characters named mankind and womankind. That's a pretty strong clue that this story is about more than just a couple, just two people back then. That there might be a lot more to it. Consider the serpent. We know from later in the Old Testament that the serpent is often used as a symbol of Egyptian power, of the Egyptian Empire, and then in later history of Babylonian power and the Babylonian Empire. So we've got mankind, womankind, and the Egyptian Empire in a story. It seems pretty clear that this is about a lot more than just two people long ago. And that side-by-sideness of mankind and womankind that's described in the Eden story, we talked about that in the previous video. The text itself tells us that this is not just, oh, isn't it nice? They had such a lovely relationship. This is not what that story is about. The text tells us that that's the reason we get married. In other words, it's clearly more than about just those two people. We are both the readers of this story and the characters in the story, because we are mankind and womankind, and we too can be tempted by the priorities of empire, and we too are called to live in a side-by-side relationship, etc. This story is about us, not just about them. Therefore, it is what's called an archetypal story. That's what John Walton calls this passage. It's an archetypal story. The characters are archetypes, that is, symbols of groups of people or types of people. It is set in the past, yes, so it shares that with history, but it is about the now. It is making statements about right now. Now, we are familiar with archetypal stories. We've seen them before, and the one example that if you've grown up in the church, that you've come across many, many times, is parables. Parables are set in the past, but they're clearly about right now. And the characters in parables clearly represent us and our different human tendencies. The prodigal son is about all of us who go off on our own and sin and think we know more, and then our lives fall apart, and we hit rock bottom, and we come crawling back and are forgiven. The older brother in that parable is about us when we see others being forgiven by God, and it makes us bitter because we haven't done all those stupid things. Shouldn't we be treated in a special way? Why is God so excited about forgiving them? We are in these stories, these archetypal stories. So, if the Eden story is an archetypal story, as John Walton and many other scholars believe it was intended to be, something like a parable, and if archetypal stories are set in the past but are really about the now, then the work of exegesis, as we try to think what did it mean then and there, the work of exegesis is to read the archetypal story of Eden from the perspective of not our now, but their now. And that brings us back to the Israelite national happiness graph. As we've already seen, early Genesis has two primary original contexts. The context of the first valley of the Exodus, where this was an empty people that needed to be filled with the good news, the gospel about God and humanity and the world. They just didn't know much, and they needed to be filled up. And then, that's when these stories were first told. And then, in the second valley, that's when these stories were written down in the form that we have today. And in the second valley, the Israelites were not an empty people. They were an emptied people. They had everything, and then had lost everything. And what they needed in the second valley was to be reminded about the gospel, reminded about the good news of God and humanity and the world. We're going to be spending most of our time thinking about the Eden story in the context of the first valley. And that's because most of what we need to hear applies to this first valley. We will discuss a little bit something particular to the second valley, but almost everything that we learn in the first valley also applies there. So let us look at the Eden story in the context of the now of the Exodus. What had happened? What had happened in recent history when the Israelites first heard the Eden story from Moses? Well, they had been slaves in Egypt. Moses had led them through the Red Sea and to the base of Mount Sinai, where he disappeared up the mountain into a cloud that represented God's presence, and he came back down with the covenant, the contract, the relationship that God initiated with the Israelites, which included the Ten Commandments. And at that point, you can't really blame the Israelites for having a little bit of a what moment. Hold on a second here, Moses. What's going on? You've just told us we're free. We've escaped from Egypt. We are no longer slaves. We're free. And then you give us a whole bunch of rules. What is going on here? And I think we forget that a lot. I think we forget that the Eden story comes to the Israelites at the same time that the law comes to the Israelites, at the same time that the covenant that God makes through Moses comes to the Israelites. It all comes as a package. And so I believe that one of the things that the Eden story is addressing is one of their primary concerns, and that is, what is freedom? And who gets it? Remember, they've just escaped from slavery. They haven't had freedom for 400 years. So this is a pretty big question. What is freedom? And who gets it? I want to look at how the Eden story addresses this. Notice that before the serpent shows up, notice what kind of situation mankind and womankind are in the Garden of Eden. And I would like to, they have three things. And I'd like to thank Walter Brueggemann, his commentary on Genesis. He set this out very, very clearly. There are three things that the man and the woman have in the Garden of Delight. They have meaningful work. They have lots of freedom to do that work. Remember, God's first command begins, "You are free." But there is a minimal restriction. Now, the story never tells us how many trees are in this garden, but they can eat from any tree but one. So it's a minimal restriction that's there to ensure human flourishing, to make sure that they can be alive tomorrow to enjoy this. These three things must be in balance in our human experience. Consider if you take away meaningful work. So you still have a lot of freedom. You can do this any way you want. And there's a minimal restriction to keep everyone alive. But it doesn't really matter what you do. It's not meaningful work. It's just busy work. Well, that's a recipe for despair. Or if you take away the freedom, there's meaningful work. We'll keep you alive with this minimal restriction, keep everybody alive. There's meaningful work, all right, but you can exercise no creativity. You have no freedom. Just do the work. Well, that's kind of what they left behind in Egypt. That's a kind of slavery. If you take away the minimal restriction that ensures everyone can live to see tomorrow, it means you have meaningful work and only freedom, where everyone can do exactly what they want and anything they want, do or take whatever they want. Well, we know where that would lead to. That would lead to chaos. It would lead to the powerful preying upon the weak, and it would lead to a highly stratified society, very hierarchical society, which would look actually a whole lot like the Egypt that they left behind. But when you have all three in balance, which is what we have in the Garden of Delight, in fact, that is the recipe for delight. So it's little surprise that it's called Eden. Okay, now, this minimal restriction, again, remember what I just said. The Eden story shows up when the law shows up. And the Eden story is really, I think, among other things, addressing this question. What's the law for? And the Eden story, in my opinion, is saying that the law is that minimal restriction that the Israelites need to ensure human flourishing. Which means we now have an answer to this question. What is freedom and who gets it? The Eden story shows us that freedom is this, what you see here. It's the perfect balance of meaningful work, lots of freedom to do that work with all sorts of creativity and new ideas, but a minimal restriction. Ironically, and maybe even paradoxically, you need a little bit of restriction in order to have true freedom. And true freedom means freedom for everyone. Who gets freedom? All do. This is how we can set things up so that everybody can flourish and experience the delight that God intended. And all of this brings us to the serpent, because now the serpent enters the story. And the serpent is, as I've said, a symbol of Egypt. Perhaps you've seen pictures like this. This is from the headdress on Tutankhamun. And what we do know is that the only person who could wear a headdress with this symbol on it of the serpent was Pharaoh. Wearing the headdress and the serpent was a symbol of a particular god, and wearing the headdress was a way of saying, I take upon myself the power of the gods to do or to take whatever I want. It's that kind of freedom, that kind of power that the serpent represents, and it was very closely associated with the pharaohs. So this was not really a mysterious symbol in the Eden story back in the original context. What happens? Well, we see, as I've laid it out, courtesy of Walter Brueggemann, we see the recipe for delight. But when the serpent shows up, the serpent does not see delight. The serpent can focus on only one thing, and that is that there is a restriction. And remember that the freedom of the pharaohs was the freedom to do or take whatever they wanted with no restriction. And so this is inconceivable. And it is a threat. It is a threat to the power of the pharaohs and a threat to the particular freedom that the pharaohs saw. It also was a threat to the pharaoh's desire to be a god on earth, to be like the gods. And so, with that in mind, and so that's why, just to get back to this, that's why the serpent just sees restriction and temptation and all this sort of, that's how the serpent sees this story. The idea that there could be freedom and flourishing for all is just not part of this worldview, the worldview that the serpent represents. So the parable of Eden, as understood in the now of the Exodus, it presents the Israelites with a choice. They have a choice. They can choose to have the true freedom that is made possible by the law, or they can choose the false freedom of the pharaohs, a freedom that grasps for power and breaks down relationships. They can have flourishing for all or for only a very few. Or put another way, they can choose to delight in their status as image-bearing creatures made by the God who delights in them and gives them good gifts. Or they can choose to see God as a competitor, as a threat to their ambition to become little gods themselves. Now, the story of Eden, or the archetypal story of Eden, or the parable of Eden, does show us some negative things. It shows us the consequences of making the wrong choice. If mankind and womankind refuse to stay within the law, relationships will break down with God and with family and even with the earth itself. And what was beautiful, meaningful work will become painful labor. We may be tempted by the freedom of the pharaohs, but it is a false freedom. It is a destructive idea that cuts us off from everything that truly brings us life. Yes, that's true. That negative stuff is in there. But in offering the choice, the Eden story also shows us, yet again, the gospel. The world is a good gift from God. God's intention is that we delight in beauty and good food and side-by-side companionship. God is a freedom giver, wanting us to have life and have it abundantly. Now, it feels to me anyway, like we're starting to change the topic from what is freedom and who gets it to what is God like. So before we get any farther down that path, let's just remember, we have seen a beautiful answer to the question here. What is freedom and who has it? The Eden story lays out what true freedom looks like, that it is a gift from God. It does require the minimal restriction of the law, but it means the flourishing of all people without a hierarchy of importance or value. That is beautiful, and that is the gospel of Genesis yet again. But we were starting to merge into this question, what is God like? And that is the other primary concern that I believe the Eden story addresses. So, what is God like? Well, we've run out of time here in episode 6. So to get the answer to that question, you're going to have to tune in to episode 7. Until then, we have had enough gospel of Genesis to last us. So, until episode 7, goodbye for now.